Everyone, good morning and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Society of Geneva. We seek to meet you wherever you are on your journey and invite you to be part of this congregation in which we draw wisdom from all the world's religions balanced with the insights of modern science. We seek to build a diverse, beloved community within our virtual walls and hope to inspire and accompany one another as we act for peace and justice in our larger world. I'd like to start with General Order number 3. General Order number 3 was issued by Major General Gordon Granger on June 19th, 1865. This was about a month after the end of the Civil War, and General Granger's mission was to assist Texans in their, transition from insurrectionists to U.S. citizens. General Order number 3 reads in part, quote, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the executive of the United States, all slaves are free." Of course, the proclamation Granger referred to was Proclamation number 95, also known as the Emancipation Proclamation, which had been signed by the president on September 22nd, 1863, almost 2 years prior. With Granger's arrival, that news had finally reached Texas. The war was over. Enslaved peoples were enslaved no longer. And for anyone who doubted the new reality, Granger's fully armed battalion was ready to help them remember. The suddenly freed were overjoyed. The world had fundamentally changed, and so had their relationship to former slave owners. General Order number 3 had this to say about the change in status, which was, quote, which involved, quote, an absolute equality of rights and of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes between employer and hired laborer. General Order number 3 became the basis for a new holiday. Juneteenth, Independence Day, Freedom Day, or just Emancipation Day. Today, we mostly know it as Juneteenth. It is the oldest national celebration commemorating the end of slavery in the United States. Today, you'll find Juneteenth celebrations aren't all that different from those immediately following the war. You'll see folks dressed up in Sunday best and sharing red foods like watermelon, barbecue, red punch and strawberry soda pop, and red velvet cake. There will be speeches, sports, parades. It's a good time, a time of pride, of hope, of connection, resilience, and family stories. In 1872, the newly freed residents of Galveston held a fundraiser and used the proceeds to buy 10 acres, which they named Emancipation Park, and made that park central to their annual Juneteenth celebrations. In that park, this year, 2021, the City of Galveston will dedicate a 5,000 square foot mural commemorating Granger, General Order number 3, and the 250,000 American lives that the Union troops finally liberated that day in June. You can see that mural behind me. The New York Times ran an article a few weeks ago describing the mural this way. So it starts, here we go. It starts with an enslaved Moorish navigator who was shipwrecked off the coast of Galveston in 1528, the first recorded non-native slave to arrive in the territory. The mural goes on to Harriet Tubman and then Abraham Lincoln, who's holding a chain with a broken manacle. And then there's General Granger seated, signing the order giving the Union control of Texas, which led to the Juneteenth order. And then behind stands one Union white soldier and 4 soldiers from the United States Colored Troops. The mural ends with a parade of people marching, including one in a wheelchair. You can see that way over there. And an astronaut with a fist clenched on their uniform. All of them marching toward the goal of absolute equality. And that's the title of the mural, Absolute Equality. This is a good time to do our thing. With the mics still muted, I'm going to remove the spotlight for a moment. And what I want you to do is hit the button in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, the one that says view. And I want you to pull that menu down and click on the word gallery. If you haven't activated your camera, now is a great time to do so. You'll know everything is working right because suddenly there will be all these faces filling up those tiny little boxes. Now, looking at all those faces, this is important. This is your community. Looking at those faces and in the spirit of our friend, the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III of Trinity Church here in Chicago, I want you to turn to your neighbor. Doesn't matter which one, just turn to your neighbor. I can see you. You know that, right? Okay, so turn to your neighbor and say, repeat after me, neighbor, oh neighbor, this is our work. Amen. Amen. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It is impossible for me to understand what 400 years of history, the history and legacy of African slaves here in the United States. Former President Donald Trump's favorite history lesson, the New York Times 1619 Project, attempted to capture the arc of that history through stories, documents, and imagery. The African American History Museum in Washington, D.C. also attempts to capture it. And for whatever it's worth, this is an experience that I absolutely recommend to you if you ever travel to the nation's capital. But like another museum, also in Washington, the Holocaust Museum, any museum or online multimedia experience, the curated part is only going to get you so far. The real horror, the real experience, the real impact of centuries of outrage, that is just impossible to, quote, capture. It will only ever be an echo, smoke, ephemeral, here and then gone. And this, of course, makes it easy to turn from, to dismiss, to ignore, to pretend otherwise. Mr. Wilson, my 9th grade history teacher, used to have a saying tacked to the back wall of his classrooms, big block letters. Those who do not learn it are destined to repeat it. Today, I know he meant history repeats itself. But back then, I was pretty sure he meant students fail and then have to repeat his class. Anyway, I think of his bulletin board often. Those who do not learn it are destined to repeat it. This is why we have museums, why we teach history, why history is important. In the maybe perhaps vain hope that tomorrow's mistakes will at least be new mistakes and not just a repeat of a mistake we ought to have learned from. You'll pardon the theological shift. This is also how karma is supposed to work too, right? In the endless cycle of birth, life, death, and rebirth, your job in any one life is to learn from the mistakes made in that life or in previous lives, to do better. Lived experiences are the lessons in a cosmic classroom in the school of eternity. At some point in the cycle, you, I, everyone will have the experience, at least the opportunity to have the experience of a life as a cricket, an alligator, an alley cat, a slave, a god. The point is to have the experience and then learn from it. And failing that, to repeat that experience until you finally do. And eventually you will. This may be the hardest part for us Westerners to wrap our brains around, but eternity is a very, very, very long time. For my part, I'm not sure I can wrap my head or heart around the idea that human suffering has some sort of necessary value. That suffering, enslavement, for example, is required for the perfection of the soul. I'm not sure I'm able to make that recommendation for anyone. And perhaps also that is part of the karmic lesson. When we collectively have reached a certain level of maturity, a certain level of process, certain level of progress, a certain height of humanity, we no longer need to suffer personally in order to understand that suffering for anyone is an offense to everyone. We can look to our stories and empathize. We can look to the stories of others and find our compassion. We can hear something in those stories that calls us to change, something that calls us to act, to lend our voices, to lend our hands, to bend the arc of the moral universe towards something like justice. In his book, Native Sons, James Baldwin wrote, quote, "I love America more than any other country in this world. And exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually." I love this quote. For me, it captures the idea of loyal opposition, the idea that it is patriotic, that it is fully American to hold our actions and the actions of our leaders to account. That you can love your country, respect her aspirations, and still demand more of her, to demand more from our people and from our institutions, to require them and everyone to recommit to our ideals: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, absolute equality. And it is in this light of loyal opposition, with this goal of absolute equality, that I want to turn now to critical race theory. You've probably heard about critical race theory, or CRT, by now. Let me start by saying that CRT is like communism, or capitalism, postmodernism, or patriotism. It is a lens, a way of perceiving the world. If that feels a little opaque, one analogy I have here, I use a lot, I tend to find it helpful: space photography. Any NASA fans here? Think of all those amazing photos we have of deep space. In many of them, we see incredible splashes of color across the night sky, as if Jackson Pollock and God were collaborating on a canvas the size of the cosmos. It's astonishing what we see. The trouble is, most of that color isn't actually there. There is light, yes. That's how we got photos in the first place. But the wavelengths of that light are often far outside of the spectrum that our human eyeballs were designed to see. Astronomers use special filters and a trick called false color to show us humans the differences in light and dust, differences that would otherwise be invisible to us. To be perfectly clear, the differences are actually there. It's just that we cannot see them without help, without a filter, without a lens. And this is how critical race theory works. What critical race theory magnifies, highlights, and tries to bring into our common view is pretty straightforward: that racism is a social construct. It's not just the manifestation of individual bias or prejudice or bigotry. Racism is something that is embedded in our legal systems and policies. And if we ever want to get close, even remotely close, to absolute equality, then systemic racism is something we must do something about. Late last night, historian Heather Cox Richardson offered some further comments. She says this, quote, "So what is critical race? Why is critical race theory such a flashpoint in today's political world? Perhaps in part because it rejects the insistence that an individual can create a prosperous life by will alone. It says that no matter how talented someone may be or how eager and dedicated, they cannot always contend against the societal forces stacked against them. It argues for the important weight of systems established through time, rather than the idea that anyone can just create a new reality. It acknowledges the importance of history." Speaking of history, you've probably read or at least heard of Ibram Kendi's 2016 book, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. And you probably also have read Michelle Alexander's 2010 book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. These two books, and literally hundreds of others, lay out in exquisite detail the extent and impact of systemic racism in the United States. At this point, a year after George Floyd's death, only malignant idiots would deny the basic truths described by CRT. Forgive me for my baldness. Only malignant idiots, which of course now brings me to national politics. In a memo sent last September, the White House described CRT a, quote, propaganda effort that teaches or suggests that the US is, quote, an inherently racist or evil country, and thereby ordered a halt of all funding for training on critical race theory for federal employees. Later that year, the Heritage Foundation piled on, publishing an astonishingly thick-headed attack on CRT. Among other claims, they derided CRT for divisiveness, for fostering a culture of victimization, hate, and shame. Worse, CRT was Marxist, relativist, liberal, anti-American, and relentlessly critical. The horror. An article published yesterday in the magazine Business Insider claims that certain politicians are, quote, offended by all of this negativity and criticism. In that article, they cite GOP Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, describing CRT as, quote, false history that would, quote, denigrate the founding fathers. I could go on, but you take my point. CRT has become politicized and will likely dominate national and local politics for the coming election cycle as one of the many attempts to distract voters from an attempted insurrection in January. The critics, though, to be fair, did get one thing right. CRT, and very specifically common CRT phrases like, quote, white supremacy culture, are offensive and provocative. And they make me profoundly uncomfortable. And they should. Because in our discussion about how to address systemic racism, CRT suggests that our discomfort is entirely the point. Discomfort is a great starting place. And Reinhold Niebuhr would have approved. As you probably recall, Niebuhr was a theologian of the 20th century and a huge critic of both Unitarians and Universalists. He's also the one who said that the point of church was to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. So if you're uncomfortable, join the club. CRT is doing its job. The problem with CRT, though, isn't that it makes me, or at least my problem, right, isn't that it makes me uncomfortable. I'm a minister. I spend most of my time uncomfortable. Now, the problem I have with it is that it misses a very particular opportunity. Because white supremacy culture is not just a vague indictment of the West. It has nothing particular to say about South America as a whole, or Africa, or Asia, maybe Europe, or at least certain parts of it. But again, not really. It also misses Canada and Mexico. Now, CRT and this idea of white supremacy culture is very particular, very pointed, and very targeted at our culture, American culture. Race and class and caste are features found all over the world. But here in the United States, something different happened, something profound, something evil. Americans enslaved human beings for profit, and as their wealth and power grew, American racism grew also, becoming something monstrous and unique. This is a feature of our history, a feature of our institutions, a feature of our past and present. This is our cultural landscape. This is us. CRT can help us see that, because CRT is a very particular kind of criticism, a very American kind of criticism. And it calls us as Americans to deal with it. This is our mess. We did a bad thing. And like karma says, it doesn't matter about today or yesterday. The point is, if we don't face it, if we do not learn from it, if we do not change because of what happened, then we are doomed to keep repeating our mistakes, world without end. Amen. Looking at the mural that will be dedicated this week in Galveston, I marvel at how far we've come and how far we have left to march. I like to believe we've taken good steps so far. The work didn't start with General Order Number 3, and it certainly didn't end there either. But Juneteenth can be seen as the last shot fired in the American Civil War. On that day in Galveston, Texas, 250,000 formerly enslaved human beings woke up to learn, if 2.5 years late, that they were free. That must have been a very good day. That is a day worth celebrating as a national holiday. 156 years later, many of us do. We celebrate our stories, our triumphs, and our setbacks, our history, and our hopes. This is a day where we are asked to not be held hostages to debates about words. We are asked to not lose track of the goal as we talk about the tools. We are asked to reject the idea that our comfort means more than human progress. We are called to act in a word indeed and indeed to make changes to the systems that oppress, to the laws that restrict, to the policies that limit human potential on something as arbitrary as the amount of melanin in our skins. As we celebrate, we are reminded. We are reminded that the work of racial justice is not only moral, not only good or right or just. We are reminded that this work is our work. This is our work. The work of the ever more perfect union. This is American work. This is the work of the American patriot, the work of everyone who believes that our best days are not behind us, but the belief that tomorrow's light is brighter still, and that we are all called forward by the blinding light of absolute equality. Juneteenth is a reminder that built into the American promise, given form by our founders, set next to the inalienable rights of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, is the promise to become better than we are now. A reminder that we as Americans love the premise and promise of our country, those ideals for which she stands. And exactly for that reason, we will insist on the right to criticize her perpetually. May we all keep the promise. Happy Juneteenth, and amen. And as we prepare to leave this place, continue your journey in love. Care for one another and care for this our earth. Do justice and make peace. And as you go, know that whatever taste or touch you've had in this time and place, hope, joy, love, or peace, that goes with you out into the world. We are different for having spent this time together. So remember, live boldly and with thanksgiving.